Thank you for inviting me and for attending. Okay, seems to work now. Because this is partly a collective endeavor that I will be presenting, a lot of the things I will be presenting, we are discussing with my colleague Claire Zalc. We have written a few pieces together over the years, first a handbook in French, then in English, the one on the slide, Quantitative Methods in the Humanities, an Introduction. And more recently, a paper in the journal Capitalism, even though the paper doesn't talk very much about capitalism, that talks a little bit more about dirty data. But this is very much an ongoing conversation that I'm going to present today, not something we have very much written about. In fact, the first time, and I will talk a little bit, excuse me, about Claire Zalc's own research project called Loubart World, but I come back to this later. And actually, the first time I wrote about dirty data, it was with a third Claire, Claire Crowston, who is a historian at that time working in the US, now in Canada, and especially a historian of apprenticeship with whom I am conducting research on this topic. And a few years ago, there was a call for paper at the social science history meeting about the relationship of historians to data. And we came up with many ideas, actually, that I will discuss today. So I'll talk a little bit about how we phrased it at the time. We began to talk about the phrase cleaning data. It's more or less frequent, I think, according to the language. In French, it's very much used, nettoyer les données. And so the idea that we want to clean the data, or data needs to be clean, was problematic to us for several reasons. One of the reasons is actually Claire Crowston is a historian of gender at work, and there's always this idea that it's a domestic task, cleaning, that's very much female and relegated to subordinates. And that's actually what happens with the idea of data cleaning in many research projects, not all of them, hopefully. But the idea that it's a boring task that has to be performed, sadly enough, but is relegated to the most precarious members of the team, sometimes doctoral students, sometimes temporary workers. So not a noble task. Even though it's supposed to be central. So that was part of the problem. And of course, the other part was the idea that the data taken from the source was in some way dirty and had to be cleaned. And we argued for keeping the data sets as close as possible to the sources, which is, I think, obvious for many people, but I would like to go to discuss the specific consequences of this today. So keeping the data as close as possible to the source, even when it doesn't seem very clean. And the idea that good data might not be big, but might be complicated, and it's a good thing, basically. So that was the source of this phrase, dirty data. And of course, people liked it, the provocation of it. And we tried to go a little bit further about it, but really mostly in our seminars. And to our surprise, a fourth Claire came in the picture as one of the editors of the journal French History. And with co-editors, she launched a call for paper, really not asking for our permission or whatever, but citing us as a reference. And so there has been a call for paper on dirty data in new quantitative histories. And we did not answer, we did not review the papers, but there will be a special issue soon. So it's centered on the history of France and Francophone countries. And it discusses these methods, and I will talk a little bit about some of the papers in the special issue. So first thing is this is an ongoing conversation and with many Claires and other people also involved. And the second thing I wanted to say that's perhaps more interesting for students, and it might be obvious for you, but it took me many years actually to realize, is that there are two lineages of people interested in employing computers in historical research. And quite often these two lineages do not overlap. and these people are not all aware of the existence of the other side. And this became particularly clear to me when we researched actually the competition when writing our handbook. And we also were researching, of course, good handbooks to cite them and use good ways to phrase things from them. And especially those are the handbooks on the slide are two very good handbooks in my view. One is by Pat Hansen and Mina Ishizu, is called History by Numbers and is centered on economic history, very much inspired by econometrics and intended for historians of economic things, maybe society, maybe population. And the other one, Exploring Big Historical Data by Graham, Milligan, Weingart, and Martin, is in the tradition of digital humanities. So taking inspiration rather from people in literary studies, sometimes art history, who have been talking with computer scientists for decades. And so we have these different traditions, and as a consequence, the two handbooks do not present the same methods. For example, in digital humanities, I think geographical information systems are quite mainstream now and considered important. Network analysis, or at least visualization, is quite mainstream and considered important, whereas they are not present at all in the other book. But in the other book, you are supposed to have a lot of cross tabulations, to use statistical testing, and maybe move toward regression. And so the basics are different in each lineage. The tools are different also. I think that you teach Python in Berlin, and it's very much in the digital humanities tradition, whereas R would be more frequent in the social science history tradition. And there are differences also in vocabulary, in the types of data that you use actually, or how you call them also, like samples versus corpora. So there are many differences in vocabulary. And when I realized this, I realized that one of the things Claire and I wanted to do and had been doing is actually bridging these two traditions in some ways. So just enhance the range of methods that we can present to students and colleagues taking from both traditions. So that's one of the things. I'll come back to this later. So we tend to think that we are somewhere in between. And in fact, we are invited sometimes on both sides. On each side, we seem a little bit like aliens because we talk also of the literature in the other side, but it's all fine. So we are a little bit in the middle, but we are also sometimes elsewhere. And this is very much related to the topic today, which is the aspiration to standardization. Because why do we want to clean data? Why do we talk about cleaning data or dirty data? It's because because we aspire to some sort of standardization for various reasons. And this has been present for a long time in both traditions, with slightly different phrasings, maybe. But I put two examples on the slides. By the way, the idea is, as this is all recorded, you can go back to the recording if you want to check the exact references to literature. And so I took the example on the quantitative social sciences side, especially the economic history side, of a long-standing effort to create a kind of ontology, even though they don't call it so, of historical occupations. So a table of equivalent occupations across space and time, so that from the names of occupations recorded in various diverse historical sources, we could derive especially a class scheme, a classification according to social class. And this is something we very much object against, but that's the whole topic of the talk, so I come back to this. And on the digital humanities / digital history side, of course, there's been the discussions of ontologies almost from the beginning, I think, in the context of the semantic web, and the question of whether to standardize, but it's generally seen as a good thing, and how to standardize. And here I took an example from a quotation, actually, from a very interesting survey of historical discussions on semantic technologies. And the authors point out that there are more source-oriented approaches and less source-oriented approaches, which are called goal-oriented approaches to standards of classification. And so they acknowledge actually the tradition we find ourselves in. I find myself in, which is more source-oriented. I will develop it. But even though we seem to present the two versions on the same footing, they have this very typical sentence saying historical data is often plagued with inconsistencies, changing structures and classifications, redundant or erroneous data, and so forth. So what a pity our sources are not clean. And so it's ironical because we actually discuss a source-oriented approach, but we still say an inconsistency is a problem. And I try to argue that an inconsistency is something interesting to study. And so that's where we situate ourselves in some ways in between and in some ways elsewhere, because we tend to be skeptical about very large, well-funded hierarchical projects in digital humanities or quantitative history, aiming at creating tools for all possible research in the future. And we, in a nutshell, of course, it's a bit of a caricature, we advocate for a more do-it-yourself approach, which is also the realistic thing to do when you advise PhD students, because very often, at least in France, they are working all by themselves, so they need something they can implement by themselves. But it's also political and scientific statement in favor of more experimental history. So doing things that will not be replicated is okay if they are replicable. I come back to this, hopefully. But trying stuff and not trying to get to the one perfect view of data in a way. But I will explain this during the rest of the talk. So I try to explain this in 4 points, probably not all the same length. Starting with maybe the most obvious thing, and the one I already mentioned, is the question of standardization, which we call categorization in our book and articles. So the general idea that you need boxes to put stuff that's in the source in. And I think the example of historical occupations will be clear for everybody. You find all sorts of occupations in the sources, more or less precisely described. Some people are two things at once, and it's a mess. When you read the sources, you have this feeling that it's a mess, and you need some sort of ordering to write about this. And there are many options as to how to categorize or standardize stuff in the sources generally, for example, occupations. And I think our point here is partly that this should be source dependent because we are always coming back to the sources, but mostly that this categorization process should be question dependent. And actually in a very specific sense, which is advice we had not given for a long time, but we are giving more and more to students, is actually to input your data when you read your sources, but to categorize mostly when you are writing, which seems a bit intense because when you are writing, you don't have much time maybe to think about a scheme for occupations and so on. So in practice, quite often you think about how to categorize your data, of course, well in advance, but it's really something that's occurring to me right now as I'm writing about access to justice, is the best ideas as to how I want to categorize my data come when I am trying to write about the results. Of course, those are preliminary drafts, not the final version, because then I know exactly what my question is. And I know exactly if, for example, thinking about the status of people vis-à-vis marriage, do I want to put divorced people along with widowers as not not married anymore, but it depends on the question. And I might do the same. I might use the two options on the same data at two different times in my writing. So that's very much our idea as to categorization is it should be um, rethought each time we ask a new research question, and thus left to each person performing research on data and to the last possible stage. And by the way, it goes very much against the wisdom coming from different disciplines. For example, I heard computer scientists say, okay, chemists have the different chemical elements. Why don't you have this in history? Or a different version was, okay, in history you are less evolved, but in the future, at some point, be hopeful. You will have something like the elements in chemistry, no doubt about it, the elementary bricks, and you will have consensus on this. And basically, we don't want this. We don't think it's good for science. We think you need to choose your categories at the last minute to write good research. It does not mean that it precludes replicability, which is a legitimate question asked, especially in the context of the semantic web, as I understand it. And we very much try to explain to students that any categorization, you should be able to explain it, to write it down in text, and or to share your code if you use code, so that another person would be able to apply your criteria. Even if you had this crazy idea of criteria for categorization that nobody had before, especially if you had this great crazy idea, we want to know about your criteria in a detailed way so that another person using the same data would come to the same result. So we very much want replicability, but we also want flexibility for you to explore your ideas at the last minute. And so just a few examples of this. Coming back to this question of occupations, just to cite a paper I personally like very much. It's old for now, but it's been an inspiration by a historian and an anthropologist, I think, about patterns of social visits from diaries written by working class people in New England in the 19th century. And they begin by defining working people, so the people whose diaries they will include in their population, in their corpus, as those who worked for a living, who had not attended college, etc. And they know the amount of property owned by the people, so we can have very specific criteria. But the interesting thing is that according to this definition of working people, school teachers are working people, which I think is unexpected for many persons thinking of school teachers in 19th century America as working people. But they elaborate on this and they make their point that it makes sense to classify school teachers as working people, and it works in their paper. And so it would not have worked if they had to follow a standard class scheme. This is a bit of a caricature. I think not many people would want to follow a standard class scheme on occupations. But the paper is also very interesting because they want to count visits and to classify visits according to their locations and so on. But a social visit described in a diary is not a very standard element of the historian's vocabulary. So they are super explicit as to how they decided what counted as a visit or not. And this is replicable for other people who would want to use diaries. It was super experimental and interesting. Another example in the forthcoming special issue of French history on dirty data is by colleagues who actually work with people who standardize metadata. And because they work on historical correspondences, so this is a multidisciplinary field interesting for historians, literature studies, art history, music history, and so on. And there have been many projects, of course, in digital humanities that have digitized a large corpora of correspondences, and there are standard metadata to describe letters correspondences. But actually, coming from a specific case of an archive of correspondences, they ask annoying questions to the authors of the set of metadata, beginning with, is the primary unit really a letter? Because these letters were sent in bundles, in what was called a letter packet. So several letters put in the same, not envelope, but kind of piece of paper. So we need something to be able to count this unit. But more annoyingly, they ask questions also about the idea that a letter has a place of writing and a place of destination, and these places could be put in a geographical information system and like disambiguated if several places are called the same and so on, which would be the classical approach to this, and we would be annoyed by ambiguous places. And they discuss at length with examples the question of what's the destination of a letter in the context of the postal system at the time. And they end up saying we might, in fact, begin to reconceptualize the destination of a letter precisely as its intended recipient, because you had few details on the address on the envelope, to use contemporary terms, basically because the idea was not to send the letter to a place with geographical coordinates. It was that it had to reach a person. And so it's allowed, of course, to translate this in terms of geographical coordinates. Everything's allowed. It depends on your research question. But wanting to put everything in standardized geographical coordinates would be to ignore that maybe in some contexts, like this one, the actual destination was a person rather than a place. And I thought this article was really interesting because they actually talk about their dialogue with people who want to standardize metadata. And like, could we add other fields or could we define this field a bit differently? And we see that it's difficult because it becomes custom made quite quickly, this story. So that was the first point, maybe the most obvious for you, as to how to categorize in the sense of putting heterogeneous information from the sources in boxes. That makes sense for research. A second point is actually what happens before, because if we want to test different categorization schemes, we need data that has been inputted, that has been just digitized in some way, OCR, manual, or whatever, in a way that is super detailed and true to the source. We need all the details if we want to have different categorization schemes, to test different categorization schemes afterwards. But I would like to point out the importance of this first step of just reading the archive in our view of quantitative or digital history. It's something maybe that's obvious to you or not, but it's super surprising for people who think of themselves as not quantitative or not digital historians. But actually, when you have to build your data set yourself from the archive, not with OCR, by reading and writing, you find yourself in a situation of slow and close reading, not distant reading at all. And it might be one of the best ways actually to focus on the details of the material is when you have to put it in a data set and you wonder, as we saw with correspondences, in which box, as which type of metadata do I consider this or that, and so on. And so we advocate for what we call sometimes verbose spreadsheets, in the sense of having many, many categories, many places devoted to comments and regarding oddities and so on. Because we think for two reasons, because it's good for source criticism, just to basically understand what your source is and which are the biases of the source and what is its point of view on reality. And also it can lead you to find interesting new research questions. And I had put as advertisement for this talk just a photo from my current research on access to justice. And so it's about people asking the French state for what's called legal aid in France, which is a bit different from, for example, the US version, is basically the state paying your attorney or your lawyer. And so these people send information on themselves and they get answers. And this is just a source that seems super simple because it's in tabular form. It's a big table that records the answers. But you see how it becomes complicated. You have this provis thing written, meaning provisionally we say yes, but might change afterwards. But most strikingly, we have different colors, different pencils, different writings. And it's not obvious what it means. And actually, I'm still trying to understand what RPM means as compared to RAS. Those are not obvious abbreviations. And perhaps the interesting thing here is that putting all this in a data set, including like the color of the ink and whatever, helps me try to see what correlates with what. And perhaps in the end, I will understand what's RAS as opposed to RPM, because RAS is like all women or all litigation about divorce or whatever. And I try to understand what it means. Thanks to this combination of very carefully reading and recording all the details of the source in my dataset, and then using it quantitatively to see what it correlates with. And just another example, a more advanced one, in Claire Zalc's Lubart World project. Just to say two words about this project, because it's interesting because I said we like small projects that you can do by yourself, but Claire Zalc is actually completing a book from a big ERC-funded project, so something with a dozen people around her, called Lubart World, which begins actually with the source you see in the pictures. That's a population register from a Polish town in the 1930s called Lubartów. Sorry for the pronunciation if there are Polish people attending. And so they started with this source recording the population of a small town in Poland. And they tried to follow the population and especially the Jews of Lubartów during the next decades all over the world using sources gathered basically for genealogists in a nutshell. But at the beginning, they had this register, and like mine, it's very much a table. It seems all orderly, and when you look closer, of course, it's always a bit messy. It's a historical source, so some things are crossed. You have different pencils and so on. And they had a paper published actually in French about inputting this data, all the small decisions that they had to make as to what to input how, to keep all the details of the source because it was their central source for later. Just an example of this on the beautiful website they have for a wider audience. They wanted to do something for a wider audience, and they actually did it before writing the research book. So they tried to visualize where the people living, the Jews actually, in this case, living Lubartów went. And at some point, they visualize something and they say, okay, we invented the destination, basically, because those are people who fled to an unknown destination, according to the register. And this is actually a visualization of people who had all the same word in Polish written in pencil with no date, but with all the other information in the source, we could deduce that it was all written at around the same date. And so those were over 1,000 people who left just upon the arrival of Nazi troops and basically eastwards, trying to join the USSR. But in the register, it's actually written in Polish unknown destination, and there is no date. And so it's only by thinking, okay, this is written by the same person with the same pencil, with the same word, and trying to deduce when it was that they could come to this visualization that keeps some uncertainty as to where exactly they went, but reduces our uncertainty. And just to take another example from my ongoing research with Claire Crowston on apprentices. This is less of a dramatic situation, of course, but basically an apprentice was not a very clear legal or statistical category in 19th century France. So we are trying to understand what people understood at the time, or what people thought of at the time when they talked about apprentices, which differs dramatically from source to source. And at the same time, we want to give a kind of an estimate of how many apprentices there were. Was it a frequent situation for a teenager to be described as an apprentice? And so I have written a chapter for this perhaps forthcoming book, uh, trying to from censuses. This is basically the official census of France as it existed in many other countries in the 19th century, enumerating all inhabitants, trying both to count those who had the explicit word apprentice somewhere. So here you have an apprentice in silk, implicitly in silk weaving, and she is 14 years old. And I wanted to put this in the context of other teenagers with no occupation mentioned, or with an occupational title without the word apprentice. So here we have two other persons, two girls aged 13 and 18, and we have the word liseuse, which is reader, which is a person who reads models in the context of silk weaving, and they are not called apprentices. And so I tried to, with a team actually of students, we inputted data on all teenagers, how the occupations were mentioned, and try to understand what were the patterns of having the word apprentice as opposed to having the name of an occupation without the word apprentice. And of course, you have also pupils and maids and so on. And so it's only by correlating this with other factors that we saw that basically people who had migrated were more likely to be called apprentices, boys were more likely to be called apprentices, younger teenagers were more likely to be called apprentices, which would make sense. But it also depended on the occupations. You had occupations where the basic idea was there could be no apprentices because it was too unskilled, and occupations where it was mixed. And so this is basically taking in the unevenness of the source, taking it seriously, inputting it as is, and then from the correlations, you derive source criticism, you understand the criteria of the people who wrote the source, and hopefully you understand also something about apprenticeship, in my case, migration during persecution in Claire Zalc's case. And I just want to go a little bit further onto very much related issues that are, I think, the issues that come up immediately when you think of dirty data, just missing data on the one hand and contradictory data on the other hand. And I have clearly too many slides on these 2 points because I want to be able to come back to those in case there are questions. So I will only comment on a few of the slides. And in each case, the idea is to keep the to keep in mind and to keep very practically in the data sets the information that data is missing or that data is contradictory as long as possible, because once again, it gives us information on the source and possibly also on the thing we want to investigate with this source, as opposed to what they call actually inputting data, sometimes in computer science or social sciences, inputting missing data in the sense of replacing missing by whatever seems most likely, because missing is annoying. So we want to do this as late as possible and in a transparent way, so that we can try a different way for this. And similarly, for contradictory data, we're not very much in favor of disambiguation. Or in fact, we do disambiguate all the time, but the idea is you do not disambiguate because ambiguity is a problem per se. You keep the ambiguity, and when writing, you decide if for this specific research question you need to disambiguate. And if it's the case, very, very often you know how you want to disambiguate because it depends on your research question. So first, missing data, just to mention another research of Claire Zalc's on migration under persecution, where missing data basically indicates that people are in hiding. So in this case, they could give an interpretation to missing, but they chose to keep a different color, including in their visualizations, for missing, which is likely to indicate the person is hiding very well, versus positive information that the person is underground or hidden or whatever. But an interesting development in the context of the Lubatword project in the register I just mentioned is the fact that you could deduce it maybe from what I said, these people were registered as either Jews or Catholics, actually. And there were a few Protestants of different denominations who were also registered as such. It was very important for the Polish administration at the time, even before Nazi anti-Semitic persecution. And so the vast majority of persons in Lubatów were registered as either Jews or Catholics. And it was actually one of the bases of the research projects to say we input data on everybody to have context on, for example, where the Jews lived, did they live in mixed neighborhoods with Catholics and so on. And then they wanted to focus on the Jews to study migration under persecution. And one of the little surprises was to find more or less 100 people whose faith was not registered, where it was left blank. And it was a bit of a surprise in this particular historical concept, context where arguably being a Jew or not was super important in many ways, even before persecution Nazi persecution. And so they took this seriously, Anton Padansin and Claire Zalc, and they have a working paper investigating these 100 people with the two basic hypotheses, and I think there are equivalents in many cases of missing data. One is what they call the lazy bureaucrat hypothesis. So it's just a clerical error. This person did not record this information, doesn't mean much more. Or these people or the person who registered them or whoever actively tried to mask their faith, which would mean they were likely Jews under persecution. And they tried to investigate this by correlating the information, the missing information on faith with everything else that's in the register. And they succeed, I think, in disentangling the two explanations. But the lazy bureaucrat part is easy if much information generally is missing on these persons. Probably the fact that we don't know whether they were Jew is not important per se. It's just a person with a lot of missing information. But the other case was super interesting. And so this is just an argument to take missing information as positive information on the lack of something, and then try to think what this something is, while there is no information. And this has an equivalent in network analysis, something I'm often called to discuss, with the quite common actually case, but under-discussed because many people hide their dirty data under their rugs and other carpets, of anonymous nodes. What you do in network analysis and network visualization, where you have anonymous, and it's probably not the same anonymous in all cases. And I wanted to cite especially a paper by Mac Shane on Nunn's writing with the question of anonymous recipients beautifully treated by doing as if it was all one big person called anonymous, doing as if it was each time a different person, and this gives you boundaries of the space of possibilities, which is one of the things you can do also to investigate missing data. And that's very much something archaeologists do. They do not all do this, but I found conversations with archaeologists on missing data, of course, enlightening because most of that data is missing anyway. And some of them have thought about how to simulate missing data in experimental ways, such as this. Finally, the question of contradictory data, I think, is even more interesting. And I argue that having several sources is an opportunity for comparison Of course, I think we are all annoyed at the first time when the sources contradict one another on such basic facts as the date of birth of an individual, which is generally thought of as something that cannot change. Almost everything can change about an individual. Of course, their age, their address, in many contexts, their gender, their names, very often. We think of date of birth or place of birth as being the one thing that doesn't change. But of course, in many or most historical research on biographies, you find contradictory dates of birth, depending on the sources. And what I'm saying is it's not a problem. It's something interesting to investigate. Sometimes it's just this famous clerical error. But still in the context of Claire Zalc's research on persecution, people lie on their age because they want to escape persecution all the time. And sometimes it's better to pretend you're older, sometimes you're younger. Same thing actually for apprentices in 19th century France. It could be interesting to pretend you are younger or older. And so what we say is when you have several sources, it's interesting if you want to compare. And so contradiction is interesting because it leads you to compare, as opposed to something we find very much as an impulse in students and as a bad practice in colleagues of looking for complementary sources only if you have missing data and using sources in an additive way. Like trying to fill in the blank in one source from the information in a different source. And we rather think that comparing sources gives you insights as to the biases of each source, and then will inform your decision if ultimately you want to disambiguate, which happens all the time. And you will decide for source A or for source B or for the earliest date of birth or the mean date of birth or any type of disambiguation. But for this decision to be informed, you need to have compared your sources first. And so there's an interesting example in the forthcoming French history special issue of inconsistencies in official censuses, in actually the totals in official censuses. And same as always, at first they thought it was a clerical error, that the grand total was not the total of all columns. And when they saw it repeatedly, they thought about what it meant. And they don't always have the answer where the error comes from, but they decided, it's a big project of digitization, they decided to point out in the digital versions the inconsistencies in the sources. Sometimes it's obvious, like mixed race people were erased from the totals, and it's interesting for a history of race. Sometimes the reasons are more mysterious. Also in the Lou-Bartwell project, just to mention it, there's a sub-project on inconsistencies in gender, which were very few actually, because Polish is a very gendered language. And so there were few people who appeared to have an ambiguous gender in the source, but still you had people with for whom using the indication from the first name for the occupation, having done their military service, having been drafted and so on, gave contradictory indications on gender. And Anton Penderson says we should think of this in other sources, actually. Try to keep the information on indications of gender that could be contradictory in any period, and do something about it. It's not necessarily, of course, the equivalent of today's trans or non-binary people or passing or whatever. It could be many other things, but it's probably interesting. The last one I wanted to mention, I have other examples. It's also in the context of network analysis and network visualization, and I think it's particularly striking, is a work by Isabelle Rosé on the Middle Age, and actually it's the 10th and 11th century, so periods with very few sources surviving. And Isabelle is using ego network analysis and visualization to change the history of the elite at that time. And one of her papers is centered on a Queen of France called Emma. And Isabelle compiled basically all the sources mentioning Emma, but what she visualizes are relationships involving Emma, but also relationships between people related to Emma. And this is very much the French, makes little sense, but the geographical French elite of the time. And so she aggregates information from all possible sources because it's a period where you can actually read all possible sources mentioning Emma. But at some point, she disaggregates by type of source. So on the left, you have a visualization of Emma's relationships. So relationships are family relationships, but also war, conflict, political alliance, and also doing things together that were important for the nobility at the time, like witnessing in a charter, things like that. And on the left-hand panel, it's according to the main narrative source. So it's a guy writing, a cleric writing about the famous people at the time. And on the right, it's from charters, actually, people signing, witnessing, being present in different roles in charters. And what's striking is that Emma, with the big blue node, is almost peripheral in her own social network in the narrative source because the source is not centered on Emma. And as a woman, even a queen, she's peripheral in the narratives. Whereas on the right-hand panel, she is central, which is partly by design because Isabel was interested in Emma, but she's not central just in terms of having many ties. She's central in terms of being an intermediary, having high betweenness in the jargon between her family and the king's family, her husband's family. And so we see a very different pattern of relationship from the different sources. And this is as much a result or even a more interesting result than what we would have by putting all the sources together. Of course, it's not a big surprise for specialists of medieval history that you'll get different pictures of reality from these two types of sources. But then Isabel, for specialist, says what this particular visualization adds to our knowledge of these types of sources. But I think it's also a message for modern historians because we have so many sources compared to Isabel, and so very often we are more preoccupied with too much, but we tend to put everything together and to devote less time to source criticism, perhaps. And this idea of separating views according to where it comes from, this is from a different paper by sociologists, actually, on contemporary poetry, but they do the same. They try to take different views of the relationships between the same people, poets here, from different sources and discuss this. I think it's a great way to center the sources in our practice of research. I had something from archaeologists again saying how important it is, especially in the context of digitization, and not to confuse what's in the digitized sources with reality. So, okay, it's the basics of history. Sources are not reality, but as what's digitized becomes more and more accessible, there is really a risk of forgetting that it's only the tip of the iceberg. And there's this beautiful chapter by Søren Sindbæk, who is a pioneer of network analysis in archaeology and has done a lot of work promoting network analysis in archaeology. But in this paper, he takes a more critical view, saying, okay, we can produce this beautiful visualization and comment on it ad infinitum. But in the end, some nodes are central just because they've been excavated and the research reports have been published and digitized. And basically they're central just because we have more information. And so this network is informative, not about the reality of, in this case, maritime networks in the Middle Age, but it's informative on what we know and what we don't know, which is not a problem. It's useful information, but it's good not to confuse the two. So that's basically what I wanted to say, and I stop here. I've been a bit long already. Is perhaps the equivalent of what's called sometimes the archival tone, I think. Well, archives have always been here, but coming back to fully understand that we are not investigating reality, we are investigating sources, and it's okay. But by a better and better investigation of sources, we can maybe get at something about reality. That's something we can do also in quantitative digital history, and not just in regular non-quantitative history. And I stop here. Thank you for your attention. I stop sharing the slides, but I can come back to any slide in case there are questions.